All right, welcome back everyone to the Panther's Flaw, an unseen vulnerability. Tonight we're diving deep into a tank that was both a marvel and, well, a bit of a head scratcher. And joining me to unravel this armored enigma is none other than the brilliant military historian Julien Dubois. Julien, thanks for being here, man. Did you bring your tank spotting binoculars?
Miles, always a pleasure. And I did actually, but I left them in my other tank. You know how it is. But seriously, it's great to be here to talk about one of history's most fascinating and frankly misunderstood war machines.
Misunderstood is right, because on paper the Panther was a beast, right? But it had this kind of Achilles heel, this double-edged sword in its design that really came back to bite it, especially on the Eastern Front. What was going on there, Julian?
Exactly. You see, the Panther was designed with this incredible sloped frontal armor, which made it almost impenetrable from the front. But to achieve that and keep the weight down, they had to make some compromises. And those compromises, particularly on the sides and the turret cheeks, became its critical vulnerability.
So, Julian, you're saying they basically put all their eggs in the frontal armor basket and left the sides, well, a little exposed?
Precisely, Miles. It was a calculated risk, but one that Soviet gunners quickly learned to exploit. We're talking about thinner armor on the turret cheeks and the hull sides, making them prime targets.
So, like the tank equivalent of having a bulletproof vest but forgetting your helmet.
Exactly, Malik. And speaking of prime targets, we've got this incredible photo of a knocked out Panther. What does that tell us about these vulnerabilities?
Oh, that photo is a textbook example. You can clearly see a massive penetration right on the front of the turret, just to the right of the main gun. That's exactly where those thinner cheeks were.
Wow, so not even a direct hit to the front was enough to save it if it hit the wrong spot.
Not if it hit that spot, and given the size of that hole, it was likely a Soviet 76mm Zis 3, or even a more powerful 85mm gun, like those on the T-34-85 or the Su-85.
Ouch, talk about a bad day at the office.
Definitely. But it wasn't just the turret, right? The photo also shows some serious damage to the chassis and tracks.
Absolutely. The left track is completely mangled, probably torn off by an impact or an explosion, maybe artillery. And the front road wheel looks shattered, which could be a mine or another direct hit.
So this tank was really put through the ringer. But what's interesting is that it doesn't look completely burned out. What does that suggest?
That's a crucial detail. The lack of extensive burn marks suggests the crew likely abandoned the tank after it was penetrated, before it had a chance to fully ignite. They probably knew it was a goner.
Smart move. Better to run than to roast.
Good point. And we can even see its tactical number, 613, and the standard Wehrmacht cross. So we know this was a German Panther. But where and when might this particular Panther have met its end?
Well, Panthers first saw mass action at the Battle of Kursk in the summer of 1943, and they had a lot of mechanical issues then, but by spring of 44, they were much more reliable.
So this could be from either period.
It could. This particular Auspuff D or A model could have been fighting in the summer or autumn of 43, or the spring of 44. It was likely part of a panzer division operating in Ukraine or Belarus.
So basically, anywhere the mud was thick and the Soviets were waiting.
Pretty much. And the Eastern Front was notorious for those conditions, right? How did that impact these powerful tanks?
Massively. While Panthers were designed for breakthrough, the swamps, the mud, the sheer volume of Soviet artillery fire, it all took a heavy toll. They lost a lot of equipment to those conditions, not just direct hits.
So even if a tank wasn't directly destroyed, the environment could just swallow it up.
Exactly. And in this case, with that clear turret penetration, it was a direct hit that sealed its fate. The crew knew it was over.
So we're looking at a tank likely knocked out during one of the Red Army's counteroffensives in 43 or 44. Maybe Kursk, the Dnieper, or even Operation Bagration in Belarus.
Those are all very strong possibilities, Miles. Each of those campaigns saw intense fighting where Panthers were heavily engaged and often lost.
A real testament to the saying, no plan survives contact with the enemy, or the mud.
Or the 85mm gun, apparently. Julian, this has been absolutely fascinating. It really paints a picture of how even the most formidable machines had their critical weaknesses. All right, Julian, so it sounds like the Panther was a bit of a paper tiger in some ways, despite its fearsome reputation.
Well, paper tiger might be strong, but it certainly wasn't the invincible beast many imagined. The psychological impact of facing a Panther was huge, but the reality on the ground, especially for the crews, was often very different.
So, like all bark and a slightly thinner bite on the sides?
Exactly. And you mentioned the crews. What was it like for them, knowing they had this incredible frontal armor, but then these glaring weak spots?
It must have been a constant tension. Imagine being in a tank that could shrug off hits from the front, but then a well-placed shot to the side, even from a less powerful gun, could end your day. It forced them to always present their strongest face.
No turning your back on the enemy, literally.
Right. And speaking of those Soviet guns, the 76mm ZIS-3, the 85mm, these weren't exactly super weapons, but they were incredibly effective against the Panther's weak spots. Was there a moment where the Soviets really figured this out and started exploiting it systematically?
Oh, absolutely. The Red Army was incredibly adaptable. They learned quickly. After initial encounters, their gunners were trained to aim for those turret cheeks, the hull sides. It became standard procedure. It wasn't about brute force, it was about precision.
So it was less about having a bigger gun and more about knowing where to shoot?
Precisely. It's like knowing where the off button is on a giant robot. Once you know, the size doesn't matter as much.
So the Panther had a kick me sign on its side, basically.
A very heavily armored kick me sign. You know, Julian, it makes you wonder about the morale. Did the German crews feel a sense of false security with that impressive frontal armor?
That's a great question, Miles. Initially, yes, there was a lot of confidence. But as the war progressed and these vulnerabilities became known, it must have been incredibly demoralizing. Imagine the stress of knowing a single, well-placed shot could bypass all that impressive engineering.
Like finding out your superhero cape has a giant hole in the back.
Exactly. And Julian, you mentioned the Eastern Front conditions. How much did the mud and terrain actually contribute to these tanks being knocked out, even without a direct hit to a weak spot?
It was immense. A panther stuck in the mud or bogged down in a swamp became a stationary target. Its mobility, one of its key strengths, was negated. Then, even a less accurate artillery barrage could disable it, leaving it vulnerable to a follow-up shot to those weak points.
So the environment was almost an accomplice to the Soviet gunners.
Absolutely. The Eastern Front was a tank killer in itself. The sheer scale, the lack of proper infrastructure, the weather, it was a nightmare for complex machinery like the Panther.
So the mud was basically the original anti-tank mine.
That's a great way to put it, Malik. Julian, any final thoughts on what this particular Panther, the one in our photo, represents? Is it just another casualty, or does it tell a bigger story?
It tells a huge story, Miles. It's a microcosm of the entire Eastern Front experience for the Wehrmacht. A powerful, technologically advanced tank brought down not just by enemy fire, but by a combination of design compromises, environmental challenges, and the sheer tenacity of the Red Army.
And sometimes that Achilles heel is just a little bit of mud and a well-aimed 85mm round.
Or a really bad GPS.
Or a really bad GPS. Julian, thank you so much for shedding light on this. It's been incredibly insightful.
My pleasure, Miles. Always a blast.
And Malik, always a pleasure having your unique perspective.
Someone's got to keep it real, Miles.
All right, Julian, so we've talked about the Panther's Achilles heel, but let's rewind a bit. When these things first rolled out, especially at Kursk, It wasn't just the enemy guns they were fighting, right?
Oh, Miles, you're hitting on a truly embarrassing chapter for the Panther. At Kursk in 43, these magnificent machines were often their own worst enemy.
Self-sabotage. Classic.
Self-sabotage? How? Were they just falling apart?
Literally. We're talking engine fires, transmission seizing up, tracks just deciding to take a vacation. Many Panthers never even reached the front lines because they broke down on the way.
So, you're telling me the most feared tank on the battlefield was sometimes defeated by a bumpy road?
Precisely. Imagine the German crews all geared up for battle, only to have their state-of-the-art tanks sputter and die in a ditch before they even saw a Soviet soldier.
Sounds like my first car. High hopes, low mileage.
That's incredible. So it wasn't just the 76mm guns, it was also like a faulty spark plug?
In many cases, yes. They rushed production, and the early models, the Ausf D and A, had significant teething problems. They were complex machines, and the logistics of keeping them running in the brutal Eastern Front conditions were a nightmare.
Ausf D and A, I love how the Germans always had these super specific, almost poetic names for their tanks, but then they'd just break down.
Well, the Panther part sounded intimidating, at least.
Yeah, Panther Ausf D with a seized gearbox doesn't quite roll off the tongue.
No, it doesn't. But you mentioned that by 44 they got better, so they fixed these issues?
They did, largely. By spring of 44, the Panther was a much more reliable machine. They ironed out many of those early mechanical flaws, making it a truly formidable opponent when it did reach the battlefield.
So they went from breakdown on arrival to breakdown only after being shot by an 85mm gun?
A significant improvement, yes. But even then, the Soviets weren't just sitting around. They brought out even heavier hitters, like the IS-2 heavy tank and the Su-100 tank destroyer.
Oh, so it's like when you finally upgrade your phone and then they release the Pro Max Ultra version a week later.
Exactly. So, Julian, how did the Panther fare against these new Soviet monsters?
Against the IS-2 with its massive 122mm gun, even the Panther's frontal armor could be challenged. And the Su-100's 100mm gun was a serious threat to those vulnerable sides.
So it was a constant arms race, even with its own internal struggles.
Precisely. The battlefield was evolving rapidly, and while the Panther was a step forward, it was never truly invincible.
Sounds like a very expensive game of rock, paper, scissors.
A very expensive, very muddy game. Julian, it's fascinating how these details, like early mechanical failures, really add another layer to the story of these iconic machines.
They do. It reminds us that even the most advanced technology of its time had its very human, very frustrating flaws.
Just like my smart home system.
Tell me about it. Julian, thank you again for sharing these incredible insights. It's been a real journey into the heart of the Panther.
My pleasure, Miles. Always a pleasure to demystify these historical giants.
And make me feel better about my car troubles.